Hey everyone, welcome to Prophet Fridays, where each Friday we are going to jump into the section of the Old Testament called the Prophets. The prophets in our Old Testament run from Isaiah all the way to Malachi. And that consists of 5 major prophets and 12 minor prophets. The difference between the two, major prophets are simply called major because they're longer, and minor are shorter. All these prophets operated within about a 400-year period, ranging from about 850 BC all the way down to 450 BC. These are when the events of the books were written. But the question that we often have when it comes to the prophets is that why is it so difficult for us to read and study these books? So I want to simply take today and ask, why is that? Why are the prophets so difficult for us? And I think I've come up with 4 answers of why the prophets are so difficult for us to read. First, we don't understand how the prophets actually worked. We don't understand how the prophets actually worked. Most of us, when we think of this idea of prophecy, think of telling the future. That these people came and God gave them some sort of supernatural message that would predict the future. That said, this is definitely going to happen. That they were predicting the future, but that's not entirely how they worked. Instead of foretelling, telling the future, prophets were actually forth-tellers. It's a very subtle but very important difference in that forth-telling is simply saying, looking at what is going on in the culture around them, recognizing the attitudes or the behavior of the people that the prophet is speaking to, and God would give them a vision or a message or something like that would simply say, you need to change your direction. You are going down the wrong path. You're doing the wrong thing. You're worshiping the wrong God. You're mistreating people. You need to come back. That's where life is found. And the overall message of the prophet isn't predicting the future, saying this is definitely going to happen, but actually of God giving people a choice. In that, he would say, look, this is the direction you're going. If you keep going that direction, these are the things that are going to happen to you. However, if you listen to my voice through the prophets, if you change your direction, well, you are going to have life. Things are going to go well for you again. It's up to you. You have the ability to change the direction you're going, to change the future. And that's how the prophets worked. But as we know, the people didn't listen. And so the things that the prophets said were going to happen did happen because the people refused. So that's how prophecy works. The second thing that we don't understand about the prophets is that we don't know very much about the time period they operated in. This makes it really hard to understand what it is that these people are talking about. So just as a really quick fill-in, the story of the Bible is God raises up a people through Abraham who has a kid, who has more kids, who have more kids, and eventually these people become the people of Israel. They find themselves moving to Egypt because there was a famine, and eventually they become enslaved. They cry out to God, God frees them from their slavery and delivers them eventually into the promised land, the land called Israel. And things go really well for the people at first. But then they get grumpy and they want a king to represent them. And God says, it's not going to go well if you have a king, a human king. I should be your king. I'm the one who knows how life works best. But they say, no, thank you. So they want a human king. So eventually Saul gets chosen as king. He fails and messes up. Eventually he gets replaced by a guy named David, who, for the most of his life, does the right thing, but even David screws it up. He has a son named Solomon, who eventually takes over after David's death, and Solomon, again, has some good moments, but eventually turns his back on Yahweh and starts worshiping other gods. And after Solomon's death, well, there was this kind of civil war where there's a fight over who is going to reign. And eventually this leads to the nation of Israel splitting into two separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom continued on with the name of Israel, and the southern kingdom became known as Judah. Now, during this period, the nation of Israel quickly abandoned Yahweh as their Lord. And eventually, sometime later, so did the southern kingdom of Judah. These people turned away from God and turned toward other gods of their neighboring cultures and worshiped them. And during this time period, these two kingdoms were constantly under threat of the superpowers of their day. So Egypt in the south, Assyria to the north, and Babylon to the east. These were growing empires who wanted to continue to militarily expand. And so these two small kingdoms compared to these larger ones, were always under threat. And so they were always looking for how they could get out of it. And they tried to make treaties with other nations or to worship other gods to get those gods pleased with them. But that's not what God wanted for them. God wanted them to return to him, that he was the one who could bless them and make them great and protect them. But the people didn't listen. More specifically, the kings didn't listen. And just as the kings go, so do the people. So as the kings turned away from God, so did everybody else. And so this is where God sent these people called the prophets, who were to come and be God's voice to the people to say, turn back to me. The third reason why we don't understand the prophets very well is we don't understand the context of what they were, of the things that they were saying. So most of the prophets actually probably preached these were sermons that they would go out into the marketplace or whatever, and they would preach them, and they got written down at a later stage. And we don't know because the prophets are just a collection of these sayings, but they're not in any sort of order. They just kind of get written down, and some of them are not exactly linear. In some of them, we have really clear context of the word of the Lord came to Isaiah during the reign of such and such a king, and during this event or something. But other times, we have no context whatsoever. It's often really helpful to read the prophets alongside those historical books of the Old Testament, like Samuel and Kings and Chronicles. That will help fill in some of those gaps. And the last thing that we often misunderstand or find the prophets difficult is that we find their words or their behavior really strange. For example, Ezekiel at one time was asked by God to bake a loaf of bread, but to use his own excrement as the propellant for the fire. Like, what is that all about? And the prophets said and did a lot of things that we would consider strange and controversial, just as they were taken back then, in order to get our attention and highlight the seriousness of the matter. And so sometimes because they're so out there, we find it hard to understand. But all of this is to get your attention. So, in conclusion, why I love the prophets, that's actually my favorite section of the Bible. The prophets emphasize love for God and love for others, but not in some religiosity sort of way, but in a way encouraging people to be devoted to the God who gives of himself over and over to them, and encourages us to seek and do good to others, to do social justice, to pursue generosity, and to care for those on the margins. And when you pay attention to the prophets, you realize that the core of their message is actually the core message of the whole Bible, to love God and to love others. And finally, I think we need to understand the prophets because they point to Jesus. They point to Jesus. If you look at the prophets, there's so much that points directly to God having to come himself in Jesus. But not only that, Jesus was a prophet himself who came to call people back to God. And so these are the reasons why we should read the prophets, and I hope that you, along with me, can enjoy this time together over the next 2 years. See you later.